as an alternative kind of explaining, where you are not so much making sense of something by looking at causes, but you are making sense of something by finding a principle which connects. And his classic example is in fact Darwin. If you think of what Darwin actually argued at the time in 1850 or so, okay, he argued that the idea of natural selection made sense of a huge variety of different sorts of data dealing with species and so on and so on and so on, and why certain species tended to survive and how they adapted to their environments and a mass of other things. What Darwin did not do was to show that there was some causal mechanism at work. He had no concept of the gene at that time. So he was proposing some kind of a functional explanation, you could say. But it became a very powerful hypothesis because the way in which he brought together a huge range of data and other claims under one central powerful idea, a central principle, the idea of natural selection. Now for Wesley Salmon, this is a very fruitful kind of explanation. Another example would be Anthony Pym's, and now I'm now putting you in the same bracket as Darwin, Anthony, so I hope you're duly impressed. Because Anthony's proposed that in several places that the idea of avoiding risk actually explains quite a number of different phenomena that people have discovered in the way in which translators behave, why they tend to prefer literal translation under certain circumstances, why they tolerate interference under some circumstances, why they tend to want to standardize their texts under certain circumstances, and so on and so on. So a number of claims can be brought together under this same umbrella of risk avoidance, which is, I think, an interesting proposal, precisely because it offers a unifying kind of explanation. It links certain translation results from results of translation research under an umbrella, which in turn links these results to other kinds of behavior which are also motivated by risk avoidance. So it makes a connection, just as Darwin made a connection between natural selection and ordinary breeding of pigeons or cattle or dogs that's done quite consciously by people who want pigeons with certain sorts of wings or dogs with certain sorts of tails. You breed them over various generations and you gradually specialize. You have a dog which has a tail or no tail or whatever, whatever you're aiming at. So what Darwin was arguing was that natural selection works in the same way as ordinary selection, breeding, done by any ordinary farmer or pigeon fancier. Darwin had a passion for pigeons. He spent years studying different sorts of pigeons. It's absolutely amazing. So I think risk avoidance is a bit like that. It's collecting or colligating, bringing together facts under a new concept. And the fact that you're bringing them together under a new concept sheds light on the facts. They make more sense because there is this general principle which connects them. I think that's a way of explaining. The fourth kind, which is also to be found in Salmon's book, but not quite as a separate category. This is my interpretation now a bit. I have, for Salmon, these are connected, but for me, I think they're not quite so connected as he makes them. This is the idea that you can explain by contextualizing, which is really a bit another way of saying that the First World War could be explained by putting it in the context of the various individual conditions, like the assassination of the Archduke, which contributed to the outbreak of the war. So you could say that history is involved with contextualizing, among other things, of course. So if you can show that a given phenomenon, your X that you are trying to explain, if you could show that it somehow fits into a wider network, a nexus of other phenomena, then it's a kind of explanation too, I think. One of my Finnish colleagues, Kaisa Koskinen, has proposed this kind of a nexus explanation for the way in which EU interpreters work within a context of a complex institution. And I think it's a very interesting way of proposing an explanation, a making sense of how these, of the particular way of working. And I think a lot of sociological research does this. We have agent network theory in sociology, which has been applied to translation by several scholars. And it seems to me that this is in itself explanatory in the sense that it explicitly tries to place individual phenomena in a network of other agents in this case. So contextualizing is also a way of showing connections and so on. Now, if there are at least these four different types, okay, if you accept all these within a broad definition of explanation, unifying, generalizing, looking at causes, and contextualizing, if these are all parts, all ways of explaining, patterns of explaining, then it may be also the case that any one of these is not sufficient. That if you really want to explain something, maybe we need to appeal to multiple explanations, not just one. This is a point made by several scholars. You can always add another explanation, which may give more depth to your understanding. It may increase your understanding. Think of Santa Claus again. You can say to the child, the presents were brought by Santa Claus, and the child can be satisfied. But after a certain point, the child might want more information. How did Santa Claus get here? How did he get down the chimney? Does he have assistants? What does Daddy have to do with Santa Claus? And so on. I remember our Santa Claus was always my daughter's godfather, who always used, for some strange reason, he would come on Christmas Day, and then about 10 minutes after he had arrived as Santa Claus, he would arrive again for lunch. And I remember one year, our daughter noticed that Santa Claus actually had the same kind of watch as her godfather, who came to lunch 10 minutes later. She was curious, you know, how come this? So we had to then make an explanation which was a bit more detailed and more realistic than the previous one. So one adds another explanation, of course, in that case. And why does he do this? Well, the custom and so on and so on. Okay, so it may be that there is a chain of multiple explanations that are related, that you need to give if you want if you want to deepen your explanation. Or maybe there is a cluster, and maybe in this cluster of explanations or ways of explaining there are also relations which are unclear and which need to be explained. And maybe we should combine different types of explanation. There's a nice quotation by Salmon, which I give here, where he questions the very possibility that there ever could be the explanation, the final explanation. And I think there's something in that. Science never stops still, does it? Our knowledge doesn't stop. There's always another explanation that you can give. So if you read this text briefly, if you can see it clearly enough, there may be several different correct explanations. Now, I think that's an interesting point. There may be, for example, both correct causal explanations and correct unifying explanations. maybe if you give both sorts of explanation, you have explained even more than if you just gave one sort. I'll give you a moment just to read that. So one could never perhaps say that a given explanation is necessarily enough and necessarily final. There might always be other explanations that one could give in addition. You never stop explaining. Would there be an ultimate explanation for everything? It's like the thing in the Hitchhiker's Guide, isn't it? It's the ultimate explanation is 42, isn't it? Doesn't that explain everything in that Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Okay. So now I make the claim that that is the main reason for putting these four types of explanation together. What I want to claim is that what they all have in common is the idea of showing relations, making connections. And what distinguishes them from each other is that different kinds of explanation focus on different kinds of relations. But what they all share is the attempt to describe or to present the phenomenon that you want to explain, the X. They all try to show that X is not isolated. X is not just by itself in a vacuum. As soon as you can show that X has some relation to something else, then I think you are beginning on the road, you are starting out on the road to explanation, because you are moving into a bigger picture in different ways. So, some of these ways you could say are similarity. I mean, if you say that we can see light as particles, or you can see translation as cannibalism, then you're using a metaphor or a simile, and you are stating or expressing a kind of similarity. But also a generalization is a kind of similarity, actually. As is indeed a correlation, which I have not talked about at all. But you could certainly see a correlation as being a kind of similarity which suggests a possible underlying cause, a co-relation, a correlation. And then there are these relations of cause. If you can establish causal conditions of some kind or other, necessary or sufficient or contributory and so on, and indeed if you can establish contextual relations, then what you're doing in each case is trying to set up relations which show connections, which show that the individual X that you are wanting to explain is not isolated. And then if you show how they fit into a theory, well then, it's the theory that explains. The theory that actually does the explaining. The theory is the explanans, the explaining thing. The theory might just be the model of the network of relations of some kind, and that does the explaining. If you think of the Ptolemaic models of the universe before Galileo, where you have the Earth in the middle and then the moon and the sun and the planets and so on, you remember? Then you could say that that model explained the solar system. It was a map of what were thought to be the relations between the various planets, and it explained. Well, it didn't explain perfectly, as we know, but it offered some understanding, which lasted for quite some time and satisfied people for quite some time. Made sense of their lives and so on. E.M. Forster wrote a wonderful novel called Howard's End, which is based around the motto, "Only Connect." And what he was talking about was human relationships, of course. But I think it's a very nice motto for anybody wanting to explain something. If you just try to see the connections, every connection you make lessens your puzzlement in the first instance, until you go on and ask again, why is there that connection? As soon as you ask why there, then you have another stage of puzzlement, and you go on looking for more connections. I think this also gives us a way of understanding what is meant by explanatory power. Because it is customary to say that some theories explain more than other theories. It has been argued, for example, that in translation studies, which is my field, that theories of translation that only refer to the skopos, one kind of cause, you might say, are weaker than theories that include more kinds of cause. Because a wider theory, which doesn't only look at purpose, allows you to make more kinds of connections. There's some very interesting work in translation theory these days which deliberately sets out to use multiple causes and to build multiple explanatory models which would explain why translations look the way they do. So the more relations and the more kinds of relations and the bigger the networks, the more general the theory gets and the more powerful the explanation is, I think. And also the more you move from description to explanation. So now we are really coming to the final couple of slides here, and then there can be plenty of time for discussion, I hope. Two reservations, really, two caveats. The first caveat is chance. One of the frustrating ideas that's coming out of quantum physics, has come out of quantum physics in the last 100 years or so, is the fact that at bottom, a great deal of what we thought was understandable turns out just to be chance. There is this random element in the way in which particles move around in mysterious ways. And it has been claimed by one physicist that maybe chance is actually a more fundamental concept than causality itself. Now that really makes one think that maybe all our attempts to find causes are doomed if we think that we will only be satisfied when we have found the 100% accurate absolute cause or explanation. Because if you do that, then there's no room for chance. But the trouble is that chance is everywhere, and you cannot escape chance. Even physicists cannot escape chance. So why should we humanists think we can escape it? I think that's one warning to bear in mind. What space do you leave for chance? And the other warning is this one. This one. Which is the Marxist point, that for many people it's not actually the understanding or the interpreting of the world which is the point. The point is actually to change the world. Well, yes, for some scholars that is indeed the case. So explanations need to be tested, which is this one. Any explanation needs to be checked out and tested against others via prediction, pragmatically. How good is it? How well does it work? I won't go into that right now. And how it can be compared with other hypotheses and so on. So you test your explanation, yes, obviously. But the place where I would really like to end is here, which is, I think, my favourite quotation on this topic, which links up with chance, and it links up with the idea that no explanations are final. This is by Forti. Forti is a paleontologist. Is that the word I want? Looking at fossils and things. Paleontologist? What's the word? I've lost the word. That's right, thank you. Working, or used to work in the British Museum. And he wrote a wonderful book about the geology of the Earth, how gradually showing how geologists gradually understood how the Earth was constructed and so on, geologically. And he mentions there that this understanding is a journey, never a destination, which I think is wonderful, because whenever you think you've arrived, and you look around, you realise that there's still another bit to go, and there's still some more understanding that you haven't got. And I think the English language is quite helpful in that respect, because it's not sort of understoodness. We haven't got such a word as understoodness. Understanding suggests this ongoing process, which I really like, which should be the motivation for any kind of research. It's an ing thing, not an understoodness sort of thing, which I like. I'll just show you those key references, which is the very last slide, so that you can just note them if you want to follow up any of those in more detail. The Croft one is his book on language universals and language typology, in which he explores this concept of generalization in more detail, which I summarized for you. That's Hempel's classic book on empirical science, which I've spelt wrong. Empirical, that should be, not empirical. Sorry. That's the Salmon reference, which I found most inspiring, most interesting. He's written quite widely, an American philosopher, on this topic, and you might find that book in your library somewhere. And that's the von Wright reference, which I also referred to, dealing with explanation and understanding. So Salmon is more concerned with the natural sciences, although he does have examples from the human sciences. And von Wright is concerned with the different patterns of explanation in natural versus human sciences. But they both go over the kind of ground which I have been discussing in very interesting ways. And so our journey continues. And it continues, I hope, with some questions and comments from the audience here or out in Webland.
Thank you, Andrew. Just bear with me a moment. No. Yes. And
Okay.
can you see that? Here I can make it just...
So who would like to start? Do you want to start with where we are here, or has anybody got a question out there that they've been asking while we've been talking?
I'll just point out to people here, as you can see, we've got now 25 people following us online. So I'm sorry, people who are in Canada and the United States, like Gandassi, Gino, Brian Mossop, it must be about 6 in the morning or something like that.
Well,
In Monterey,
those of you I know.
we started at 4 in the morning.
We should have started at 4. It would have been much better. Yes.
So I apologise for the timing, people in the Americas. We didn't do a good job for you, and thanks for getting up really early. People can ask questions here in the hall and online. If people want to ask you, raise your hand in the chat room online, and we can give you the floor. People, other questions? John, can you come up here for the microphone so people in Webland can hear you?
Yeah. If I stand here, will it pick me up?
Sorry?
Do you want me to go?
You can
Yeah,
use,
up
use,
here
use
or...
the mic.
Yeah.
I understand. Thank you very much. Really stimulating. Lots of things I want to say. I'll try this is the one that's been sort of at the back of my mind from near the beginning. I understand when you began by talking about description and use of metaphor, and then moved towards, I think the metaphor used were harder explanations, sort of more solid, let's say, more towards explanations that science would recognize as valid. okay, so what happens when we consider an explanation which 400 years ago was considered a perfectly watertight scientific explanation for the body, and medicine was therefore based and administered on the idea of the humours, you know, that inside us we had fire, water, earth and air and so on. And people consumed medicine in the conviction that these were the very best science of their time. Okay, now obviously as science advances, that is revealed not to be true. Or I suspect that what's revealed is it's revealed to be an inadequate metaphor, or we come up with a better metaphor. But surely our current medicine in 200 years' time will be considered by the people who follow us to be just as erroneous and limited. And so what will currently appear to be a hard scientific explanation is destined to become a good attempt at a metaphor. Do you see what I mean? So what I wonder is there this nice, neat, no, you never suggested it was nice and neat. Is there this point at which a metaphorical, descriptive type of explanation turns into something that would be considered hard and scientific, when, as we move through time, what in one moment appears to be hard and scientific will be laughed at and be considered just another poetic attempt, mythological attempt to explain some phenomenon? Thank you very much.
Well, you've raised some really big issues there. Since you've mentioned medicine, I mean, one can certainly just think of the various dietary advice that we have been given over the last 10 or 20 years. And drink coffee, drink red wine, don't drink any coffee, don't drink any red wine, this is good for you, that's good for you, and then it isn't another 5 years later, it's all back to front. I imagine that a lot of what we eat, for example, what we think, our knowledge about what we should eat, if you go in 200 years' time, people will be absolutely horrified at what we put into our mouths, perhaps, if there's anybody around to be horrified. But, okay, yes, do theories which appear to be empirical, do they become metaphorized, as it were? Thinking of the humours, do you think that people believed that they were literally water, fire, air, and something, earth, in the body, or whether they were taken metaphorically at the time?
Shall I answer?
Well, I'm thinking, hang on a minute, I'll think aloud for a bit, and then you can come back.
When you go to the doctor and he tells you, oh no, you've got microbes, you take that. You don't take that, oh, this is just a metaphor. You take
okay,
that
so the doctor said I've got microbes. Is that what doctors say these days? Have you got microbes?
John's
as well?
got.
Well,
John's got microbes. John's got microbes, okay. So what happens when the theory gets out of date? You were worried that the science of today will turn out to be the myth of tomorrow, as it were.
No, I'm not worried about it. I'm convinced, like you said, understanding is an ongoing process.
It's an ongoing process.
I know it will become.
Yes, okay. There's another concept that I didn't mention, but could mention, which is perhaps will bring some optimism here, which is truth-likeness. Not truth, but truth-likeness. Okay? In other words, an approximation to the truth. Which is used by some philosophers of science, which I quite like because it's a bit more humble, a bit more modest than assuming that we are going to arrive at the truth one day. The idea here is that one can hope, one probably believes that the medicine, for example, since you started with medicine, our medical knowledge of today is more truth-like than our medical knowledge of 400 years ago. But it may be that in another 100 years' time that it will be still more truth-like. Or think of, to go back to physics, think of Newton versus Einstein. I mean, when Einstein comes along and says that we need relativity, Newton wasn't right, what he was really saying is that there's a corner of Newtonian physics that needs to be corrected, and that Newtonian physics is one particular. It explains something but not everything, and I can give a bigger context which would explain other things. So it's a kind of a slight correction, you might say. He's not really saying that Newtonian physics is useless. because all that was built on Newtonian physics, all the Victorian engineering projects and goodness knows what else, they clearly work. So a theory, and we should bring in effects here too, a theory or an explanation has effects, but the effects are real, they're not metaphorical, even though the theory may have a metaphorical content. Now I'm losing the thread of what you were asking. Rephrase the question again that you started with. I've lost the thread, I'm afraid, there.
Or we could move to a new question.
Well, let's just give him one more chance.
Give him a chance.
Can you rephrase? And I'll rephrase for the...
In the continuum between metaphorical description to hard science,
Okay.
obviously in the university we are led to believe that we're trying to move always towards the harder science end of things.
Well, I'm not... yes, is there a continuum between the metaphorical and the hard science?
Okay, I was going to think that the suggestion is that there isn't. That when something moves into a